Frank Hamilton Cushing arrived at the Zuni Pueblo in September of 1879 as an ethnologist attached to the Bureau of American Ethnology, sent with a mandate to catalogue and describe. He was 21 years old and already showing the fragile constitution that would kill him 20 years later, and he had been assigned a period of 3 months. He stayed for 4.5 years. The Zuni had let him stay. They had seen enough of what he was willing to do, which was to stop describing and start learning, and over the years that followed he acquired the language in its ceremonial depth, was initiated into the Bo priesthood, and was given a Zuni name the English alphabet could not render cleanly. By the summer of 1891, he was 33 years old, in his second posting at the Pueblo after a period of recuperation in the East, and he had been trying for 2 years to persuade the Bureau of American Ethnology to authorize something they had shown no interest in authorizing. The letter he sent to John Wesley Powell in August of that year is 3 pages in his close, slanted handwriting, preserved in the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian Institution, and what it asks for is permission to go below the Mesa. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Mesa runs northeast of the main Pueblo. The Zuni call it by a name that layers its meaning across several registers of the language, arriving at something near the place where the first one spoke upward. Cushing had been taken there in each season of his 2 postings, and each time he had been allowed only to walk the surface and stand at the face of the rock where the openings were cut. There were 7 of them, each one squared, each corner held at a right angle, that the surrounding desert erosion had not softened across whatever centuries had passed since the work was done. The stone around the cuts bore no radial scoring, no progressive chipping of the kind that sandstone work leaves behind. The openings were finished with a precision Cushing, recorded carefully in his field journals, now held at the Smithsonian, and the precision of what he documented there was the first thing about the Mesa that the institutional record of the Zuni region chose not to investigate. No survey in the years of his posting had been authorized to go below. No official inquiry had been opened into the age of the openings, the nature of the cutting, or the geometry that placed all 7 of them where they sat in the rock face. He spent 2 seasons standing at those openings before the right moment arrived to ask what was below them, and another 2 before anyone in the Bo priesthood was willing to tell him. The ground beneath the Zuni Pueblo and the surrounding Mesa country is layered in a way the surveys of the 1880s and 1890s described without fully accounting for. A sandstone formation sits on top of an older limestone shelf, and beneath that shelf, solution cavities the survey reports describe as enlarged by deliberate excavation. In 1887, the Army Corps of Engineers conducted a surface survey of the Mesa as part of a territorial irrigation assessment for the region. The supervising engineer was a Lieutenant Aldred Whitmore, and his field log, filed in the Corps archives in Washington, recorded the 7 openings in language that did not attempt to place them in any known engineering tradition. Whitmore wrote that the apertures appeared artificial and of considerable age, and that their orientation, when mapped, formed a geometric pattern he could account for by no natural explanation. He lowered a weighted rope into 2 of the openings and recorded the depth at over 60 feet before the rope went slack, unable to determine from his position whether it had reached a floor or a ledge. He noted the measurement in his log without further comment, which is itself a detail. An irrigation engineer who finds a naturally occurring cavity records how much water it might hold, not how deep a rope falls before it stops returning tension. Whitmore recommended a follow-up survey with excavation authority. The relevant pages of his field log end on the 14th of October, 1887. The next substantive entry is dated nearly 4 months later, from a different posting, and Whitmore does not mention the Mesa again in any document that has been located. Cushing had not seen Whitmore's field log when he wrote to Powell in 1891. The survey and the ethnologist were working from opposite directions toward the same ground, and neither institution that employed them saw a reason to put their findings in the same room. What Cushing had was the Zuni account. Over seasons of careful listening, Sitting with members of the Bow priesthood, in the context that trust had taken years to establish, he had assembled a picture of what lay below the mesa that the core survey notes could only approach from the surface. The elders described what was down there in terms they were precise about, but that Cushing wrote to Powell he could not translate without losing what he called the architecture of the account. They were not speaking in metaphor. They were giving physical descriptions of rooms that existed below the rock, rooms that had not been built by the Zuni, built instead by a people the elders referred to in ceremonial language as the stone speakers. The rooms, in the Zuni account, were not dwellings, they were archives. The stone speakers had placed them below the mesa deliberately because the temperature there did not change with the seasons, because moisture could be controlled, because what was stored inside was neither food nor tools nor weapons. It was something the elders described as the account of the world before the separation. Cushing transliterated the Zuni word for what was stored as Shiwani Toa, which he rendered provisionally as the speaking stones, and in a later letter as the stones that hold what was said. The separation, in Zuni ceremonial history, marks the boundary between the time before and the time after. Cushing had heard the word for it spoken aloud only 3 times across his years at Zuni, always in private, always among the most senior members of the Bow priesthood, and it was never elaborated in any public ceremonial context he was permitted to attend. The elders also spoke of a man. He was referred to by a ceremonial title Cushing, translated as the keeper of the lower account, and he had descended into the chambers, by the elders' reckoning, in a year corresponding to somewhere around 1791 by European calendar reckoning. He had spent 3 days below before being brought up by rope. What he said when he came up did not enter public ceremony. It passed into the oral custody of a small group within the Bow priesthood, transmitted from one keeper to the next under conditions that Cushing spent months of careful work earning the right to hear described. What was transmitted was this. The man had found rooms that extended further than a person could walk in an hour. The walls carried marks he did not recognize, cut into the stone with precision, and filled with a substance that remained visible in torchlight. At the deepest point he reached, there was a room sealed from the inside. Cushing underlined that phrase in his letter to Powell. Sealed from the inside. He noted that the keeper had not been able to determine from his position outside the sealed room how the sealing had been accomplished, and that he had not attempted to breach it. The instruction the Bow priesthood held regarding that room was specific. It was not to be opened by any Zuni hand, because what had been placed inside had been placed there for a time that had not yet arrived. To open it before that time would cause what the elders called a collapse of the account, a loss of continuity between the record inside and the world above it. The letter makes the case in the measured language of institutional request, the physical openings, the depth measurement, the consistent geometry, the Zuni oral account assembled across a decade's work, the keeper's testimony transmitted through 4 generations of custodial holding. Cushing was not asking for speculation to be entered into the record. He was asking for excavation authority and the paper to use it. He acknowledged that the Zuni had governed access to the mesa for longer than the Bureau had existed, and that any investigation would need to proceed with Zuni consent, which he believed was obtainable given the trust the Bow priesthood had extended to him personally. The letter frames the request as urgent, precisely because that trust was personal and not transferable. If Cushing left Zuni without authorization, no subsequent Bureau ethnologist would be positioned to make the same request from the same footing. Powell's response, dated 6 weeks after the August letter, does not acknowledge the request. It addresses Cushing's health and his upcoming return to Washington for recuperation. Administrative matters. The question of excavation authority at the Mesa does not appear in any subsequent Bureau correspondence that is currently accessible. The evidentiary record, placed beside what that record was supposed to generate, reveals its shape by what it does not contain. The 7 openings documented by Whitmore in 1887 align, when mapped against the ceremonial geography of the Pueblo, with the 7 directional markers of the Zuni cosmological system. This was not a connection Whitmore made. He was an Army Corps engineer conducting an irrigation survey, and the interior logic of Zuni ceremonial geography was not a category his field log contained. The connection was made by a researcher named Elsie Clues Parsons, working on Zuni ceremonial organization in the 1920s, who published the finding in the American Anthropologist in 1924. Parsons had not seen the 1887 field log when she wrote the paper. She arrived at the alignment from the ceremonial side alone, and a colleague who located the Corps archive log later confirmed the convergence in a footnote appended to the paper's second printing. Parsons described the alignment as striking and deserving of further study. No further study was published. The field journals from Cushing's second posting at Zuni, 1888 to 1892, are held at the Smithsonian Institution in two separate collections. The 11 journal volumes are in the National Anthropological Archives and are accessible to credentialed researchers. A separate set of 11 notebooks, described in the archive finding aid as working notes and draft correspondence, are classified as restricted access under a designation applied in 1932. The finding aid does not explain the basis for the restriction. Researchers who have applied for access have been told that the restriction is under periodic review. That review has been ongoing for more than 90 years. The notebooks cover the exact period of Cushing's Mesa research and his correspondence with Powell about the excavation request. The overlap between what the notebooks cover and what the institutional record of that period chose not to pursue is the shape of the gap the restriction maintains. The document that formally closed the institutional question was the Bureau of American Ethnology's 1893 report on the Zuni region. 2 years after Cushing's departure, the Bureau conducted its own field assessment covering Pueblo architecture, agricultural systems, and ceremonial calendar. The Mesa appears once in a footnote described as a sandstone formation of no particular archaeological interest. The author of that footnote was Matilda Cox Stevenson, who had been conducting Zuni fieldwork for years and who had a documented professional dispute with Cushing running through Bureau correspondence, a dispute over methodology, attribution, and access to ceremonial knowledge. Whether the Mesa footnote reflects a genuine assessment of the site's significance or something else is not a question the report addresses. What it shows is that by 1893, the official institutional record of the Zuni region had arrived at a conclusion about the Mesa without engaging the evidence Cushing had spent 12 years assembling. The gap that runs through the official record is specific in its shape. It covers the Mesa, it covers the 7 openings, it covers the stone chambers the Zuni described, it covers the transmitted testimony of the keeper of the lower account. The 1887 Corps survey recommends follow-up and receives none. The 1891 excavation request goes unanswered. The 1893 report produces a footnote instead of a field investigation. The 1924 Parsons alignment is documented and not pursued. The 1932 restriction on the Smithsonian notebooks has stood for more than 9 decades without a public basis. Each of these is an administrative decision that left no document acknowledging itself as a decision. Together they show what the official record of the Zuni region chose not to carry, and the choosing was consistent across institutions and across the exact scope of evidence the Mesa question generated. Cushing left Zuni at the end of 1891 and never returned. His chronic throat condition had worsened through his second posting, and Washington had been pressing for his return. He was taken to the Mesa one final time before his departure, allowed to stand at the edge of the first opening, with elders holding torches above the shaft. What he saw, by his own account in a letter written to a personal friend in Philadelphia in December of that year, was cut stone below him, walls meeting at right angles, a smell coming up from the opening of dry air that had not moved in a long time. He estimated the depth at more than 40 feet. He wrote to his friend that he was going back to Washington, that he did not expect the Bureau to act on what he had found, and that he had done what he could from his position. The December 1891 letter to the friend in Philadelphia, identified in the Smithsonian finding aid only as R.H., survived in a private collection and was donated to a regional archive in Pennsylvania in the 1960s. A transcription appeared in a small circulation journal of Southwestern Anthropology in 1978. It is Cushing's closest approach to a final testimony about the Mesa. He wrote that whatever had been placed below the rock had been placed there to outlast everything built above it, and that the stone speakers had understood something about permanence that the civilization above the Mesa had lost hold of. He did not write what he believed the sealed room contained. Either he did not know, or he had decided that paper was not the place to commit it. The Zuni oral record preserves through this period a continuity the written record does not. The stone chambers had not changed, by the Zuni account, between the keeper of the lower account's descent in 1791 and the morning Cushing stood at the opening's edge in 1891. The sealed room was still sealed. The marks on the walls were still there. The Bow priesthood had held the transmitted testimony across 4 generations of keepers with the same care the stone speakers had built into the design of the chambers, a record placed below because below it would last. The federal agency that arrived in 1879 to document Zuni civilization had spent 12 years in contact with that record and produced no institutional recommendation to investigate what it described. The keeper's account traveled from the limestone below the Mesa to the letterhead of the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington and was acknowledged with a response about health and administrative scheduling. That is where the accessible record leaves the matter. The notebooks sealed in 1932 contain whatever Cushing wrote during the 4 years of his second posting, including whatever correspondence and working notes he generated around the August 1891 letter to Powell. Whether those notebooks hold more than the journals, whether they contain the kind of detail that would have made the Bureau's non-response to the excavation request difficult to defend on the record, is not known to anyone outside the institution that holds the restriction. The restriction was applied without explanation and has been maintained without explanation. The notebooks are listed, the contents are sealed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The mechanism by which the Mesa question was closed was not a single instruction on a single date. It was the accumulation of smaller decisions made in different offices over years, each of which chose the same direction. Whitmore's follow-up was not authorized. Cushing's request was not acknowledged. Stevenson's report did not go to the Mesa. Parsons's alignment was not followed up. The notebooks were restricted without explanation. These are not all the same kind of decision. Some were administrative, some budgetary, some reflect the organizational reality that 2 federal agencies rarely cross-referenced their field findings in the 1880s and 1890s. But the result of the accumulation is that the Mesa question, which had at least 3 independent lines of evidence pointing toward it by 1924, was never investigated by any institution with the authority and resources to do so. The notebooks restricted in 1932 were sealed 40 years after the events they document. By that year, Cushing had been dead for 32 years. Powell had been dead for 30. The Bureau of American Ethnology had been reorganized under the Smithsonian's administrative structure, and the institutional memory of what Cushing had found, and what he had asked for in 1891, was held, if it was held anywhere in the official record, in the files of an ethnologist who would never return to New Mexico, and an archive sealed without a stated reason. The finding aid notation is straightforward. 11 notebooks, restricted access, designation applied 1932. Under periodic review. 9 decades of periodic review have not produced a release. The notebooks cover exactly the years in which Cushing documented the Zuni account of the stone chambers and attempted to persuade his institution to go below and verify it. The keeper of the lower account came up from the chambers after 3 days in 1791 and spoke to the small group within the Bow priesthood who held the custodial responsibility for the transmission. He described the rooms. He described the marks on the walls. He stood outside the sealed room and did not open it, because the instruction was specific, and he followed it, and then he spent the remainder of his life as the keeper of the account he had given. What the elders told Cushing about the keeper's final years is that he said nothing further about what he had seen, not because he had forgotten, but because the telling had been given once, in the right conditions, to the right people, and repeating it outside those conditions was not part of the instruction. He had descended, witnessed, and returned, and the account passed from him to the next keeper as a single transmission. That keeper passed it to the next, across 4 generations and 100 years, until it reached Cushing in the 1880s, at which point it entered the written record for the first time, in the field journals, in the letters to Powell, in the working notes that became the restricted notebooks. The oral account was older than any federal archive. The written record of it lasted precisely as long as the institutional attention span that Cushing could maintain by virtue of being alive and employed. When Cushing died in 1900, no other bureau ethnologist held the same access. The Bow priesthood had granted his access on the strength of 12 years of specific individual relationship. That relationship ended with him. Matilda Cox Stevenson, who continued the Bureau's Zuni work and had her own long fieldwork history there, did not have access to the Mesa accounts in the form Cushing had. The institutional knowledge of what the Mesa contained did not transfer to the next Bureau ethnologist the way a surveyor's field notes transfer when a surveyor is reassigned. It was personal, earned, and it died with Cushing in a Washington hotel room in April of 1900. The obituary in the Washington Post described him as one of the most gifted ethnologists the country had produced. It mentioned Zuni at length. It did not mention the Mesa. The Parsons alignment, published in 1924, was the last moment in the written record when the Mesa question had the possibility of institutional uptake. Parsons was a respected figure in southwestern anthropology. The American Anthropologist was the main journal of the field, and the footnote confirming the convergence with Whitmore's 1887 survey came from a colleague working independently. 2 researchers, working without coordination across the ceremonial and engineering records, had arrived at the same geometry. A convergence of that kind, in any other context, would have generated a follow-on study. The paper did not produce a response from any institution with authority over the Mesa or its surroundings. No follow-up study is recorded in the anthropological literature of the period. The alignment was documented, attributed, and filed. The decade that followed saw substantial anthropological work in the Zuni region. None of it addressed the openings. By 1932, when the Smithsonian applied the restriction to Cushing's notebooks, the gap between what the Mesa question had generated and what the institutional record had done with it was 37 years wide. The argument the record makes is not explicit in any single document. No letter from Powell or Stevenson states that the Bureau has examined the Mesa question and decided not to pursue it. No core order explains why Whitmore's recommended follow-up was never authorized. The Smithsonian restriction on the Cushing notebooks carries no stated basis. The 1893 report's Mesa footnote offers no methodology for arriving at its conclusion. What the record makes explicit, instead, is each individual absence, the follow-up not conducted, the request not answered, the investigation not opened. The absences are a pattern only when placed beside each other, and placing them beside each other is not something any of the institutions that generated them had an interest in doing. The result is a record that documents a question without engaging it, across 6 decades, across multiple institutions, with a consistency the administrative disorder of the period cannot fully account for. The stone chambers, if the Zuni account holds, were built for exactly this situation, to outlast the civilization that built them, to sit below the changing surface, in the temperature that does not shift, in the air that does not move, until whatever time the stone speakers built into the logic of the ceiling had arrived. The keeper of 1791 descended and came back up with a description of rooms already sealed for centuries by his reckoning. He did not know what was in the sealed room. He knew only that it was sealed from the inside, and that the instruction regarding it was clear. That instruction has been honored through every custodial transmission since. The sealed room was still sealed when Cushing stood at the opening's edge in 1891. The core rope went slack at 60 feet in 1887. The notebooks that cover Cushing's years of work on this question are still restricted in Washington. The geological survey record supports the Zuni account at the physical level. The solution cavities in the limestone shelf below the sandstone are described in core survey reports as enlarged by deliberate excavation. The reports that use this language do not speculate about the origin of the excavation or its age. They record the physical fact, attribute it to deliberate human action, and move on to the irrigation assessment they were commissioned to produce. Natural solution cavities in limestone form through water and time and follow the path of least resistance through the rock, which is rarely squared and rarely consistent in dimension across a horizontal span. The core notes do not describe natural cavities. The physical evidence of deliberate excavation in the limestone below the mesa is in the official record. It was placed there by a core supervising engineer in 1887. It has not been revisited in any publicly accessible survey since. The physical site is observable from the surface. A flat-topped sandstone formation northeast of the main pueblo. The 7 openings, in whatever condition more than a century of desert surface exposure has left them, are within Zuni governance under the land recognition agreements of the 20th century. The Zuni tribe's Historic Preservation Office has documented the openings as traditional cultural properties. They are not open to outside researchers. The Zuni have not invited outside investigation into the site. The account they hold of what is below the rock is managed within the Zuni nation's own custodial structures, which have been managing it for longer than any federal archive has existed. The distinction the Historic Preservation Office maintains between traditional cultural properties requiring protection and sites requiring archaeological investigation is deliberate, and it has been held consistently across every land governance agreement the century produced. Cushing's attempt to place the Zuni account into the official record was the closest the stone chambers came to institutional investigation in the 130 years since his departure. The letters to Powell, the field journals, the restricted notebooks, the December letter to R.H. in Philadelphia, these are the paper trace of an ethnologist who had earned access to something the written record of the American West had no category for, and who spent the last years of his working life trying to give it one. Powell's non-response was the end of the institutional engagement. The letters went into the archive. The notebooks went into restriction. The questions stayed below the mesa. In the rooms, the temperature kept constant. In the air that had not moved. The Bow priesthood's transmission of the keeper's testimony continued through the 20th century and continues now. The Zuni tribe's Historic Preservation Office, which documents traditional cultural properties, including the 7 openings, operates under a governance structure that keeps the interior record of the mesa separate from anything it shares with outside agencies. What the Preservation Office documents publicly is the fact of the openings' existence and their status as protected cultural properties. What the Bow priesthood holds is the account of what lies below them, and those are not the same institution, governed by the same rules, accountable to the same external oversight. Whether the Bow priesthood's account of the chambers includes anything learned or transmitted since Cushing's departure, whether the custodial chain has remained unbroken through the governance changes of the 20th century, is not known outside the institution that holds it. That institution is not the Smithsonian. It is not the Corps of Engineers. It is the Bow priesthood of the Zuni Pueblo, which has been managing the account for considerably longer than any of those other bodies have existed. The sealed room at the deepest point the keeper reached in 1791 is, in the Zuni account and in the instruction transmitted through the Bow priesthood since, still sealed. The instruction against opening it has been maintained through more than 2 centuries of custodial transmission, through federal pressure, through the years of Bureau ethnology that placed outside researchers inside the Pueblo, through the changes in governance and land management that followed. The sealed room was placed from the inside by the stone speakers. The keeper stood outside it and came back up and said so, and the saying has been held ever since, passed from one keeper to the next, in the same private conditions of transmission, under the same instruction that it was not for Zuni hands to open, for a time that had not yet arrived. Whether that time, by any reckoning internal to the Bow priesthood, has been reached since Cushing's departure, is not something the Zuni tribe's Historic Preservation Office has addressed in any document made available to outside inquiry. What Cushing smelled from the opening's edge in 1891 was the air that had not moved. He wrote about it in the December letter to R.H., one of the last pieces of Zuni fieldwork he committed to paper before his health took the work from him. The dry air, the cut stone visible in the torchlight below, the walls going down at right angles into a depth the torch could not reach. He had stood there and looked down into something the Bureau of American Ethnology had no intention of following him toward, and he had known it, and he had written about it anyway, to a friend rather than an institution, because the friend would receive it in a way the institution had already declined to. The question of what the stone speakers were, in the Zuni account, is not one the official record has engaged with. The elders described them as predecessors, builders of the chambers before the Zuni came to the Mesa, architects of an archive whose purpose was the preservation of a record, through whatever interval of time separated the building from the finding. Cushing's rough calculation in the August 1891 letter placed the construction at a minimum of 8 centuries before the Zuni themselves had come to the Mesa, which by European reckoning would put the work somewhere in the range of the 1st or 2nd century. He acknowledged the margin of error was substantial. He did not claim precision. He claimed that the elders were describing something real, physical, and below the ground, and that an account held for 100 years through strict oral custody describes something real, or it does not hold for 100 years through strict oral custody. The Smithsonian restriction on the Cushing notebooks will reach its centennial in 2032. The finding aid will note, as it has noted since 1932, that the restriction is under periodic review. The 11 notebooks covering Cushing's years of Mesa research, his Powell correspondence, his final seasons inside Zuni Trust, will remain listed without accessible content. The Parsons alignment, documented in 1924 and confirmed in a footnote to its second printing, will remain the last moment in the published anthropological record when the Mesa question came close to being taken up by a second researcher from outside the Zuni nation. The keeper's testimony, transmitted now through more custodial hands than can be counted from the outside, will continue to be held by the Bow priesthood, in the conditions of custody the stone speaker's design made necessary, below a sandstone mesa in New Mexico, where the air at the bottom of the shaft is still the air that has not moved. The shaft still drops. The notebooks are still sealed. The mesa is still there, northeast of the Pueblo, within Zuni governance, and closed to outside investigation. The Army Corps rope Whitmore lowered in 1887 measured 60 feet before it went slack. No rope has been lowered since by any institution with authority to document what it reaches. The question Cushing carried from the opening's edge in 1891 to Powell's office in Washington, and that Powell's office returned without an answer, has not been opened by any subsequent institutional inquiry. It sits at the edge of the official record, documented in its approaches and never in its depths, sealed as thoroughly as the room the stone speakers sealed from the inside for a time they considered specific. The stone speakers built for duration. The Bow priesthood has kept for duration. The institutional record around the Mesa is, at every point it touches the question, also sealed for duration, though not by the same design, and not toward the same end. The time the stone speakers specified has not been announced. The notebooks are still in Washington. The sealed room is still below. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.